In the winter of 1862, neighbors in Millerville, Georgia heard children crying through the night. Day after day, the sounds grew weaker. When Sheriff Hamilton finally broke down the door of the Whitmore cabin, he found 3 children barely alive, their mother sitting calmly in a rocking chair, watching them starve. But Martha Whitmore had food in her pantry. She had money in her drawer. She simply refused to feed them. What the sheriff discovered that day would haunt the town for generations, because Martha Whitmore wasn't acting alone. The Civil War had torn through Georgia like a wildfire, leaving families broken and communities struggling to survive. But in the small farming town of Millerville, located 30 miles south of Atlanta, one family's horror story would prove that sometimes the greatest evil doesn't come from war or poverty. Sometimes it comes from within your own home. Martha Whitmore had moved to Millerville in 1860 with her 3 children after her husband died in a mill accident. Sarah was 8, Thomas was 6, and little Mary was barely 4 years old. At first, the neighbors welcomed the widow with open arms. The local church provided food and clothing, and several families offered to help with farm work. Martha seemed grateful, always smiling and thanking everyone for their kindness. But something changed in the spring of 1862. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, who lived in the cabin closest to the Whitmores, first noticed the shift. Martha had stopped bringing the children to Sunday service. When Eleanor visited to check on the family, Martha would answer the door, but never invite her inside. The children, who used to play in the yard and wave to passing neighbors, were nowhere to be seen. "I asked Martha where the little ones were," Eleanor would later tell the sheriff. "She just smiled that strange smile and said they were resting." But it was the middle of the afternoon on a beautiful spring day. What child rests when they could be playing outside? By summer, the children had completely disappeared from view. No one saw them at the general store, at church, or even playing in their own yard. When neighbors asked Martha directly about her children, her responses became increasingly bizarre. "They're learning to be quiet," she would say, her eyes distant and unfocused. "Children need to learn discipline. They need to understand that not everything in this world is meant for them." Thomas Bradshaw, who ran the general store, kept detailed records of all purchases. His ledgers show that Martha continued buying food regularly throughout 1862, but only enough for one person. When he asked about feeding her children, Martha replied, "They eat when they deserve to eat. Right now, they're learning what it means to go without." The townspeople began to whisper. Some thought Martha had sent the children to live with relatives. Others worried she had sold them to traveling merchants, a practice that had become disturbingly common during the war years. But a few neighbors suspected something far darker was happening inside the Whitmore cabin. If you're finding this story as disturbing as we are, make sure to subscribe, because we dive deep into the darkest true stories that most people are afraid to tell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. As autumn turned to winter, the whispers became desperate pleas for action. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town's only physician, had grown increasingly concerned about the welfare of the Whitmore children. He had delivered little Mary 4 years earlier and remembered her as a bright, energetic child who loved to laugh. The silence from the Whitmore property troubled him deeply. "I could hear them sometimes," recalled James Fletcher, a farmer whose property bordered the Whitmores. "Late at night, when the wind was just right, you could hear crying. Weak, hollow crying that didn't sound quite human anymore. My wife begged me to do something, but what could I do? A man can't just break into another family's home based on sounds carried on the wind." But the sounds weren't just carried on the wind. Mary Catherine O'Brien, a teenage girl who often walked past the Whitmore cabin on her way to fetch water from the creek, began noticing small handprints on the inside of the windows. The prints appeared and disappeared, as if tiny hands were pressing against the glass, trying to signal for help. "The prints were always low on the windows," Mary Catherine later testified. "Like children trying to reach up as high as they could, but they weren't strong enough to reach very far. Sometimes I would see the curtain move just a little, like someone was hiding behind it, watching me walk by." Sheriff John Hamilton had been hearing the complaints for months, but without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, his hands were tied. In 1862, Parents had almost unlimited authority over their children, and interfering with family matters was considered both legally and socially inappropriate. But when Mary Catherine O'Brien came to him in early December with a disturbing discovery, everything changed. "I found this caught on a tree branch near their property line," she told the sheriff, holding out a small piece of fabric. It was from a child's dress, torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. "It's from little Mary's Sunday dress. I remember because my mother made it for her last year." That same week, Dr. Morrison received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, Martha's sister-in-law who lived 2 towns over, had come to inquire about the family's welfare. She explained that Martha had stopped responding to letters and hadn't brought the children to visit in over 8 months. Martha was always strange, Agnes told the doctor. Even before her husband died, she had these ideas about children needing to suffer in order to build character. She used to say that her own mother had been too soft on her, and that's why she had such a difficult life. But I never thought she would actually. Dr. Morrison pressed for more details. Agnes revealed that Martha had grown up in a household where food was used as a reward and punishment. Martha's mother would force her children to watch her eat full meals while they went hungry if they had misbehaved. Sometimes the punishments lasted for days. "Martha told me once that hunger taught her more about life than any book or teacher ever could," Agnes continued. "She said it made her strong, made her appreciate what she had. I thought it was just talk, but now I'm wondering if she's doing the same thing to her own children." The doctor immediately went to Sheriff Hamilton with this information. Combined with the fabric evidence and the ongoing reports from neighbors, it was enough to justify a welfare check. On December 18, 1862, Sheriff Hamilton approached the Whitmore cabin with Dr. Morrison and 2 deputies. Martha answered the door as she always did, with that unsettling smile and a calm demeanor that seemed completely disconnected from reality. When the sheriff explained that he needed to check on the children's welfare, Martha's response chilled everyone present. "The children are exactly where they need to be," she said. "They're learning important lessons about life, about deserving what you get and getting what you deserve." Sheriff Hamilton pushed past Martha and entered the cabin. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The main room appeared normal. There was food in the pantry, firewood stacked neatly by the hearth, and Martha's personal belongings arranged carefully throughout the space. But when the sheriff called out for the children, the response came from behind a locked door at the back of the cabin. The crying was so weak it was barely audible, but it was definitely human. Sheriff Hamilton demanded that Martha unlock the door. When she refused, Deputy Wilson broke it down with his shoulder. Inside the small back room, they found all 3 Whitmore children. Sarah, now 9 years old, was sitting in the corner holding her younger siblings. She couldn't stand without help, and her arms were so thin they looked like twigs. Thomas, 7, was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Little Mary, who should have been a vibrant 5-year-old, looked more like a broken doll than a living child. Dr. Morrison immediately began examining the children while Sheriff Hamilton confronted Martha. Her response revealed the true horror of what had been happening in the cabin for months. "They needed to learn," she explained matter-of-factly. "My mother taught me that children who expect to be fed without earning their food grow up to be weak and useless. These children were becoming spoiled by the kindness of others. They needed to understand that survival requires sacrifice." The sheriff asked how long the children had been locked in the room. Martha's answer shocked everyone. "Since spring," she said. "I've been giving them small amounts of food and water, just enough to keep them alive. They're learning patience. They're learning that the world doesn't owe them anything." Dr. Morrison discovered that Martha had been feeding the children approximately 1 small meal every 3 to 4 days. She had been giving them just enough water to prevent death from dehydration, but not enough to maintain their health. The children had been living in their own waste for months, and their bodies showed signs of severe malnutrition and abuse. But the most disturbing discovery came when Sheriff Hamilton searched Martha's belongings. Hidden in her bedroom, he found a detailed journal documenting her treatment of the children. The entries revealed a mind that had completely disconnected from reality. Day 47. Sarah begged for food today. I explained that begging is undignified and that she must earn her sustenance through proper behavior. She will receive nothing until she learns this lesson. Day 73. Thomas attempted to reach the door handle. This shows he has not yet accepted his situation. Extended fasting will help him understand his place. Day 156. Mary has stopped crying. This is progress. Children must learn that tears accomplish nothing. Only quiet acceptance leads to reward. The journal entries continued for over 200 days, each one documenting Martha's systematic starvation of her own children with the clinical detachment of someone recording a scientific experiment. Dr. Morrison worked frantically to stabilize the children while Sheriff Hamilton arrested Martha. She showed no emotion as the handcuffs were placed on her wrists. Even as her children were carried out of the cabin on stretchers, she maintained that she had done nothing wrong. "You'll see," she told the sheriff. "When they grow up strong and independent, you'll understand that I was teaching them valuable lessons. My mother taught me the same way, and it made me who I am today." The tragedy of the Whitmore children became the talk of Georgia. Newspapers from Atlanta to Savannah covered the story, with headlines describing Martha as the monster mother of Millerville. But for the people who lived through it, the horror wasn't just what Martha had done to her children. It was what happened after her arrest. Sarah Whitmore, despite months of starvation and abuse, survived and eventually recovered physically. But she never spoke about her experience, and she never spoke to her mother again. Thomas suffered permanent damage to his internal organs and died 2 years later from complications related to his malnourishment. Little Mary, the youngest, seemed to recover completely, but she began displaying behaviors that troubled everyone around her. Mary would hoard food, hiding pieces of bread and fruit throughout her new home with her Aunt Agnes. She would sometimes refuse to eat for days, explaining that she needed to save it for when I really deserve it. Most disturbing of all, she would sit in dark corners for hours at a time, perfectly still and silent, as if she were still waiting for permission to move or speak. Martha Whitmore was tried and convicted of child endangerment and abuse, crimes that carried serious penalties even in 1862. But her trial revealed something that the townspeople of Millerville found even more terrifying than her actions. Martha wasn't insane, at least not in any legal sense. She was completely rational, completely aware of what she was doing, and completely convinced that she was right. During her testimony, Martha calmly explained her philosophy of child-rearing. She described her own childhood in detail, revealing a pattern of abuse that had been passed down through generations. Her mother had starved her as punishment. Her grandmother had done the same to her mother. Martha saw this treatment not as abuse, but as effective parenting. "Hungry children learn to be grateful," she told the court. "Children who are given everything they want grow up to be weak and entitled. My children were learning strength, learning resilience, learning that nothing in this world comes without cost." The prosecutor asked if she felt any remorse for what she had done to her children. Martha's response sent chills through the packed courtroom. "I feel remorse that I was stopped before the lesson was complete," she said. "My children were so close to understanding what they needed to learn about life. Now they'll grow up weak and unprepared for the hardships they'll face." Martha Whitmore was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but she would never serve her full sentence. In the spring of 1865, just as the Civil War was ending, Martha died in her cell under mysterious circumstances. Prison officials reported that she had simply refused to eat, starving herself to death with the same methodical determination she had used to starve her children. But that's not where the story ends. After Martha's death, strange things began happening in Millerville. Neighbors reported hearing children crying from the abandoned Whitmore cabin, even though it had been empty for years. Mary Catherine O'Brien, who had discovered the bloody fabric that led to the children's rescue, began experiencing vivid nightmares about small hands pressing against windows. Dr. Morrison, who had helped save the Whitmore children, found himself unable to sleep through the night. He reported dreams where he could hear Martha's voice explaining her twisted philosophy of child-rearing, always ending with the same phrase: "They needed to learn." But the most disturbing reports came from families with young children. Parents throughout Millerville began noticing their children behaving strangely. Kids who had never met the Whitmore children began refusing food, claiming they needed to earn their meals. Some children would sit in corners for hours, perfectly still and silent, as if they were waiting for permission to move. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, Martha's former neighbor, reported that her own grandchildren would sometimes point toward the empty Whitmore cabin and say they could see a woman in the window, watching and smiling. When Eleanor looked, she never saw anything, but the children insisted the woman was always there. The town's new sheriff, David Patterson, received dozens of reports about the Whitmore property over the years. People claimed to hear voices inside the cabin, see lights in the windows, and smell cooking food coming from the chimney. Every investigation turned up nothing, but the reports never stopped. In 1870, the Whitmore cabin was torn down and the land sold to a farming family from South Carolina. The new owners, the Brennans, seemed unaware of the property's dark history. They built a new house on the same spot and moved in with their 4 young children. Within 6 months, the Brennan family fled Millerville in the middle of the night, abandoning their home and all their possessions. They left behind a note for Sheriff Patterson that simply read, "She's still teaching. The children won't stop learning." The Brennan house stood empty for 3 more years before another family attempted to live there. The Caldwells lasted only 2 months before they too disappeared in the night, leaving behind similar reports of children behaving strangely and a woman's voice echoing through the house at all hours. By 1875, no one in Millerville would even walk past the property after dark. The land where Martha Whitmore had systematically starved her children became known as the teaching ground, a place where something evil continued to influence anyone who came too close. Sarah Whitmore, now a young woman of 22, had moved to North Carolina and changed her name, but she couldn't escape her past. In letters to her Aunt Agnes, she described ongoing nightmares where she could hear her mother's voice explaining why she deserved to suffer. Sarah never married, never had children, and spent her adult life working with orphaned children, trying to protect them from the kind of treatment she had endured. Little Mary, who had seemed to recover from her ordeal, grew into a troubled teenager who struggled with eating and self-worth. She developed a pattern of self-starvation that worried everyone around her. By age 16, she had been in and out of medical care multiple times, always for issues related to malnutrition and self-imposed hunger. In 1878, Mary Whitmore disappeared while visiting the town of Millerville for the first time since her rescue. She had told her Aunt Agnes that she needed to finish learning the lesson that her mother had tried to teach her. Her body was found 3 days later in the ruins of the old Whitmore Cabin Foundation. She had starved herself to death in the exact spot where her mother had once held her prisoner. The coroner's report noted that Mary had enough money with her to buy food for weeks, and there were stores within walking distance of where she died. Like her mother before her, Mary had chosen starvation when she had other options available. The report concluded that she had died by her own choice, but the people of Millerville knew better. Martha Whitmore was still teaching, and her lessons were still being learned. Local historian James Worthington, who documented the Whitmore case in 1885, wrote, "The horror of Martha Whitmore was not that she was a monster who appeared among us without warning. The horror is that she was created by the same kind of treatment she inflicted on her children, and that her evil continues to create more victims long after her death." The property where the Whitmore cabin once stood has changed hands 17 times since 1862. No family has ever lived there for more than a year. Current land records show that it's owned by the state of Georgia, but local residents still report strange occurrences in the area. People walking past the empty lot claim to see a woman standing among the trees, always smiling, always watching. Children in Millerville still sometimes refuse food for no apparent reason, explaining that they need to learn their lesson first. And on quiet winter nights, when the wind blows just right, residents swear they can still hear the faint sound of crying coming from the place where Martha Whitmore taught her children about hunger, suffering, and the twisted logic of survival. The most recent incident occurred just last month. A family visiting Millerville for a historical tour stopped to take pictures near the Whitmore property. Their 8-year-old daughter, who had never heard the story, suddenly refused to eat dinner that night, claiming that the nice lady said I needed to wait until I deserved it. When her parents asked what lady, the child pointed toward the empty lot and said, "The one who's still teaching the children how to be strong." Martha Whitmore died over 150 years ago, but in Millerville, Georgia, some lessons are never finished, and some teachers never stop teaching. The question isn't whether Martha Whitmore's spirit still haunts the place where she committed her crimes. The question is whether she ever really left at all, or if she simply found new students to educate in her twisted philosophy of survival. But that revelation opens up an even darker question about what really drives someone to harm their own children, and whether evil like Martha's can truly ever die. Because if the reports from Millerville are true, then Martha Whitmore's most terrifying lesson might be that monsters aren't born.